I don't think I'll ever forget the day my little brother Richie and I got off the school bus and headed home. I remember being hungry and hoping that Mom would have something we could eat before dinner. Everything was fine until we turned the corner. I didn't really realize what was going on. There were people in our yard, and there was a big truck in front of the house. I saw my mom sitting on the concrete steps in front of our house crying. I saw my dad with an angry look on his face talking on the phone. My dad was big, tall. He always tried to look like he was in charge. The problem was that he rarely was. As we got closer to the bustle in front of the house, Richie grabbed my hand. "Billy?" he asked with a tremor in his voice. "What are all these people doing outside our house?" "I don't know," I answered him. I went to my mom to find out. When I asked her what was going on, she said through tears that we had been victimized. Many weeks later, with the four of us squatting in a small one-bedroom apartment, I realized what she had told me that day. She told me that we were not victims. She told me we were evicted. It was quite a while before I realized what that meant. I think my dad was around for about another year. He was always angry at anyone. It wasn't his fault that his family had fallen below average. It was always his boss, the idiots he worked with, his stupid clients, neighbors, politicians, and so on. When he finally stopped coming to our little apartment, it was a real relief. Of course, our cash flow suffered, and the little luxuries we could have when Dad lived with us evaporated. On the other hand, we didn't have to listen to him rant about the injustices the world subjected him to. It was much more peaceful without him. It must have been another year after he left that we learned he had died. No details were given to me. My mom cried, and I tried unsuccessfully to conjure up a sense of sadness. He had become such a small part of my life that his death didn't have much meaning to me. But through my economically tumultuous childhood, the one profound memory that stayed with me was the day we walked home from school with Richie and were taken from our home. I knew I never wanted something like that to happen again. Next chapter. The only gift I got from my father was his genetics. My father was tall, and by the time I was in high school, I was 6 feet 5 inches tall. By my senior year of high school, I had grown another half inch and weighed 220 pounds. I was fast and quite athletic. I was good on the high school basketball team, but I was great at high school football. In the old days, getting a high school varsity letter in a different sport each season was an accomplishment. In today's sports world, if you want to be good, you specialize. So I started specializing in football. My high school football team was good. We didn't have a chance to win against powerhouses like Jesuit Prep and Eisenhower, but we eventually made it to state and won our first game against Capital from Olympia. I caught 8 balls and scored 2 touchdowns for East Milton. Eisenhower ended up winning by defeating a team from Vancouver. I was named first team All-State and had several scholarship offers. I ended up signing with the Washington State team. I was tempted to play for the University of Washington so my mom could see me play, but the Huskies didn't seem as interested as the Washington State Cougars. As a freshman, I played in a few games, catching 8 passes and scoring 1 touchdown. Our senior defensive back was Wendell Washington. He made the PAC-12 second team and will most likely play in the NFL next year. Our team was average and we got to a lower-level bowl. But the main game every year was a rivalry game against the University of Washington. That game is called the Apple Cup. Washington was one of the best teams in our conference and was expected to win the Apple Cup every year, which usually happened. And my sophomore year, they came back with a late score and beat us. Their junior year, they beat us by 3 touchdowns, and the arrogance of the Washington players was only surpassed by the arrogance of their fans. After that game, they threw trash and showed a complete lack of sportsmanship. I still remember standing on our sideline and watching the arrogant Huskies celebrate in our stadium. It was horrifying. My senior year was a successful one for me. I was an honorable mention preseason all-league selection. And importantly, I stayed healthy. I practiced hard all winter and all summer. I broke up with my girlfriend and was 100% focused on football. I was in the best shape of my life. It was hard work, but it was worth it. We approached our last regular league game, the Apple Cup, with a 6-5 record and would be heading to one of the lesser bowls again. So far, statistically, I had a good year. I had 41 receptions for 655 yards and 8 touchdowns. I was projected to be a first-team All-League selection and possibly be named America's best player. Before the last league game, the Huskies led 10-1. If they beat us like everyone expected, their path to the Rose Bowl would be open. The Huskies were led by their star quarterback, Nathan Nelson. This year's game was played at Husky Stadium in Seattle. We expected a loud and hostile crowd. The end of November in Seattle is usually humid, and today was no exception. When we took the field, the air was full of booing and taunts from Husky fans. I'm usually a pretty reserved person, but today I hated the Huskies and their fans. There was nothing I wanted more than to beat these guys. It didn't start off well. They scored a goal right away. Nelson scored a goal. Our movement stalled and we started hitting shots on goal. They started having trouble on offense too, and by halftime they were ahead 10-0. The weather was affecting the play of both teams. We scored 2 field goals in the third quarter, and they scored 1 touchdown. Washington leads 17-6 going into the fourth quarter. The rain picked up in the fourth quarter, and both teams slowed down. We were able to turn the tide when the Huskies lost a slippery ball at their own goal line. Remarkably, we managed to score our first touchdown, but we missed the extra point. The score? 17-12, Huskies ahead. For most of the quarter, neither team could get things going on offense. The ball was wet, so passing was difficult. With just under 3 minutes left in the quarter, we found ourselves at the 35-yard line. Our quarterback called for me. All the other receivers went to the left, and I ended up on the right side. I don't think I'll ever forget that play. In fact, I think that game made me a lot of money. It was in the top 10 games of the day on ESPN. I've seen the replay so many times that I have it completely memorized. I ran 5 yards from the line of scrimmage and then cut sharply. A short but quick defender pressed tightly against me. When I turned around, I saw a spiral heading toward me. The quarterback didn't have time to pass me, and I heard the sharp sigh of the defender anticipating the glory of the interception. As the ball headed our way, we both jumped up. He had better position, but I was bigger, much bigger. In the air, I hit him hard and made the reception. He collapsed to the ground. I ran down the right sideline. I was well into Husky territory when a free defender diagonally caught up to me. The moment he jumped to tackle me, my left hand delivered a hard blow right to the top of his helmet, knocking him to the ground and catapulting me forward. Moments later, I crossed the goal line, and this time we realized the extra point. For the first time in the game, we were leading, 19-17. Everyone on our sideline was watching the clock. There was 51 minutes left in the game. And unfortunately, Washington State had a reputation for snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Nervousness reigned on our line. We started the game, and almost as if scripted, the Huskies' offense came alive and raced down the field with confidence. The roar of the stadium was deafening. Finally, with 24 seconds left in the game, they were on our 19-yard line, 4th down, and they led their team in field goals. Our coach called a timeout. We gathered ourselves. "Billy, I want you to stand right behind the nose guard," Coach said, looking at me. "We've practiced that before. Watch the corner, jump as high as you can to try and deflect that kick." I nodded. I was the tallest athletic guy. We practiced this situation. We just never had to use it before. As we lined up in a line, we heard the Huskies talking. "This is our home. It's that goddamn cogging again. Go home to your farm," etc., etc. We were silent. For me, everything was happening like it was in slow motion. I was hyper-conscious. The ball bounced, the holder laced up, and the kicker bent over to make the kick. I think the bad weather affected the trajectory of the kick, It came out low. I timed the jump perfectly, so I wasn't even surprised when I felt the ball hit my fingertips. The tipped ball went straight up, and I cradled it against me as it came back down. I curled up on the ground holding the ball in my hands. We had won, and I was a hero. A late touchdown, and then a blocked kick. For a few days, I became a national celebrity. I was invited to be interviewed on some national sports shows, and the semi-famous game-winning plays were repeated numerous times over the next week or so. In the eyes of Washington State and University of Washington fans, I permanently became either a legendary hero or the asshole who kept the Huskies out of the Rose Bowl. Either way, my minor celebrity was often recognized by both sides. What surprised me most was the polarizing effect the outcome of that game had. Years later, while socializing with a Washington State fan, I briefly became a celebrity. And yes, I met the exact opposite negative reaction when a Husky fan found out who I was and what I had done. Next chapter. I was drafted in the third round by the San Diego Chargers, made the team, and received a 3-year salary that averaged $825,000 per year. After paying my agent's fee and taxes, I was taking home a little more than half of the total. For most of the first year, I barely participated in any games, on special teams or for blocking, but certainly not a single play was dedicated to me. But that all changed with 4 games left. Our primary defensive lineman tore his ACL, and the backup injured his shoulder in the first quarter of his first game as a starter. Suddenly, I found myself in the starting lineup. I expected NFL players to be superhuman athletes, much faster and stronger than me. To some extent they were, but very soon I realized that I could compete with them and do well. In the last 4 games, I have recorded 11 receptions, 127 yards, and 2 touchdowns. I started to get noticed as a player. My sophomore year, I played steadily, while our main player was recovering from knee surgery. At the end of that year, my agent informed me that the Chargers wanted to extend my contract. That was good news. We ended up agreeing on a 3-year, $6 million contract with a guarantee. My agent said I could have gotten more, but I was so happy to sign for that amount that I quickly signed. The first thing I did was buy my mom a house. Old memories of eviction were deeply lodged in my brain. I paid cash for a small house in Linwood for her and my brother Richie. No one would ever take that house away from my family. Unlike many of my teammates, I didn't make any other luxury purchases. No fancy exotic cars, no flashy jewelry, no luxury condos in La Jolla or Coronado. I still wore jeans and t-shirts. I shared an apartment with 2 non-starting teammates and drove a used Toyota Tacoma. The only major purchase was a house for myself in a decent West Seattle neighborhood. Pretty soon, Richie and his buddy moved into that house. They paid my rent. The rest of my money was handled by a financial planner, a guy I went to high school with, Danny Murphy. Throughout that year, I didn't make the starting lineup, but I played a lot. By the penultimate game, I had 18 rebounds and 4 touchdowns. I was turning into a solid journeyman. I envisioned a long career in the NFL. I knew that by playing sports, I could earn a good income that would provide for the rest of my life. I started thinking about a new car and splurged a bit. It's a good thing I didn't. It was early December, and we were playing an away game in Baltimore. The Ravens team was good, led by their physical defense. And midway through the third quarter, our quarterback called a Z-19 triple. 3 receivers went forward, and I burst right through the center. The Ravens dropped both defenders, and an outside linebacker came at me. I lost it by fooling my head and found myself open over the center. Our quarterback threw high, and I jumped to catch the pass. I fell on my left foot. Unfortunately, the moment my foot touched the ground, I felt a kick from Ravens middle linebacker Miles Tillman, and I heard the crack of tearing ligaments and shattered bone. I groaned in pain as I collapsed to the ground, still holding the ball. I had never felt pain like this before. I was quickly carried on a stretcher to a waiting ambulance. The collision was so gruesome that the replays didn't show it. When I finally saw what had happened, I was surprised I hadn't lost my leg. It had twisted so unnaturally on impact with Tillman. I spent a few days in a Baltimore hospital and had a long conversation with a surgeon about my football career. One conversation had a significant impact on my decision about my future. Son, the orthopedic surgeon told me, I can repair your knee and you can try to play again if you're very insistent. But I've seen guys come back to play with injuries much smaller than yours, and by the time they're 40, they can barely walk. The choice for me was obvious. When he left the room, my decision was made. I mentally came up with a budget. I had saved and invested most of my money earned in the NFL wisely. After buying my house and my mom's house, I had just under $4 million left, which Danny managed. The game against the Ravens was the last time I played organized football. I spent most of the next year in physical therapy, rehabilitating my knee. Fortunately, it was all done at the Chargers' expense with the help of their medical and training staff. I progressed and got an encouraging long-term prognosis for my injured leg. Next chapter. Nearly a year later, I was barely limping. I spent the year focusing on physical therapy and rebuilding my leg. The Chargers were contractually obligated to finish paying me for the year. Those were the terms of my contract. So I didn't have a job at this point, and I didn't need the income. But things changed very quickly. I was living in a house I'd purchased in West Seattle, with no mortgage payments. Against the advice of my financial advisor Danny, I paid cash for it. That profound childhood experience of having our home taken away from us made a lasting impression. When I moved back from San Diego, my brother Rich and his buddy Dallas Crenshaw lived there. They paid me $500 a month in rent, which was a great deal for them. They also had to take care of it. I hadn't been to my house in almost a year. I was surprised at its condition. Rich, I turned to my brother. Dallas was sitting on the couch playing video games. This place is a dump. I asked you to keep it clean. There's shit everywhere. I grabbed a black garbage bag and started packing up. Chill out, Billy, Dallas called out to me from the couch, his eyes fixed on the video screen. We're on it, he said nonchalantly. I didn't say anything back and stared at him. I took a deep breath and limped over to Dallas and his video games. Rich noticed my stare. Billy, he exclaimed. 3 steps later, I snatched the video game console out of Dallas's hands and hurled it across the room. Hey, man! Dallas protested and started to get up. I had to hand it to him. He was trying to physically challenge me. He was probably no taller than 5 feet 9 inches and 160 pounds. I towered over him. When he tried to get up, I pushed him back onto the couch. He jumped up again. I was much bigger and stronger than Dallas, but he didn't seem the least bit afraid. He fixed his gaze on me. After a 15-second stare, he sat back down. What the hell are you doing, man? He asked me angrily. I'll tell you what I'm doing, I said. This is my house, and you, Dallas, are its tenant. I can evict you whenever I want. Technically, that wasn't true, but he didn't know that. So as long as you're here, you obey my rules. Understood? I leaned over him, poking my finger in his face as he sat on the couch. He didn't answer anything, only nodded his head briefly. There was an undercurrent of fierceness in his expression. Okay, I said. Rule 2 is to keep the house clean. What's Rule 1? Rich asked me. Pay rent always on time, I told him. Now clean the place up, and I mean now. And I tossed a bag of trash to Dallas. I was a little rougher than I needed to be, but I wanted to let them know, especially Dallas. This is going to be a tight ship, and if I started giving them slack, it would probably only get worse. After that first explosion, the 3 of us got along pretty well. I still had to occasionally lash out at Dallas, but gradually he got better. Having roommates wasn't ideal for me, but it was acceptable for the moment. I knew things had to change soon, since I was the one who was going to be the one to make the biggest adjustments. Since my high school years, football had always been a huge part of my life. Now, obviously, I couldn't play anymore. In addition, I didn't have a job and my paycheck at the Chargers was about to expire. As I evaluated my life, I knew I had to have some sort of income. I also knew that at some point, I would want to have female companionship. I had a girlfriend, Chrissy, throughout most of my sophomore and junior year at WSU. She was a cheerleader, and I met her at football. Chrissy was a year older than me and graduated at the end of my junior year. She had a job in Denver and wanted to continue our relationship. At that point, I was less committed to the relationship, and we broke up. It wasn't some messy, emotional breakup, more of a situational decision based on where we were both at in life. Truth be told, I think she still wanted to try to make a relationship work, but my senior year of high school, I was focused on football. There were many nights, though, when I thought about Chrissy, about her slender body, tightly encased in a cheerleading suit, and then remembered that same body without the suit. More than once I thought about calling her, but then I remembered our last conversation. Next chapter. This could work out if we prioritize things right, Chrissy told me, her eyes looking at me with a pleading expression. Chrissy, honey, I told her, right now my priority is football. It's my senior year, I can play professional football. I'll try to see you when I can, but I have to think about the future. I remember looking at her and she at me. I hoped there would be understanding in her gaze, but she just stared at me dumbly. And then silent tears ran down her cheeks. Oh, Chrissy, I said, and moved to hug her. Billy's not here, she said, raising her hands palms up in protest. I stopped. In my mind, this was only a temporary break in our relationship. Obviously, for Chrissy, it was more than that. She took a deep breath. I need to catch a flight to Denver, she told me. She wiped away her tears and spoke in a more businesslike tone. But please, Billy, do me a big favor, she turned to me. Sure, princess, anything, said I, thinking that maybe everything would be okay after all. Please don't contact me, she said, and turned and walked away. That was over 4 years ago, and I honored her wish. I didn't talk to her, but I often thought about her and wondered if I had made a big mistake. Next chapter. It's Friday night, and I'm with my brother Richie, Dallas, and their buddies. We're at the Reef. As usual on a Friday night, the place was packed. The Reef was something between a friendly neighborhood bar and a pickup spot. The Reef had two main attractions, cheap booze and barbecue hot dogs. They got their sausages at a German diner in North Seattle called Schultz's. Schultz's sausages were fantastic, and the Reef had them cooked over an open fire. Good food and cheap booze always provided a crowd on the weekends. I quickly noticed that many of the girls at the Reef were a little different from the Chrissies of the world. They drank more, flirted more. That night, I got to talking to a girl who I think was named Leslie. I was a very minor celebrity, playing professional football, and I was easy to spot because of my size. Toward the end of the evening, I talked her into having a nightcap with me at home. With minimal formality, I informed Rich and the others that I was leaving, and I know they saw me leaving with Leslie. During the Uber ride to my house, we sat closely together, talking and laughing the whole way. When we arrived, there wasn't even the slightest attempt to pretend we were actually having a nightcap. We went straight to the bedroom. A few moments later, I heard a brief knock on my bedroom wall from the next room. Dallas. What was that? Gasped Leslie. Nothing, I said. Never mind. Where were we? I asked. The next morning, Richie and Dallas were in the kitchen when Leslie and I came out of my room. Good morning, I called out to them as we entered the kitchen. Rich, Dallas, have you met Leslie? I asked. At least my brother had enough manners to be polite to Leslie. Dallas was different. I haven't met her yet, but I'd really like to. He said it with a smirk. I looked at Leslie and she was clearly embarrassed. It didn't take a giant leap to realize that Dallas was peeking at Leslie, who had enjoyed her vocals the previous night. Sure, Leslie would never be confused with the typical neighborhood girl, but she was a sweet girl who had some pride and didn't need the comments of this immature asshole. I said nothing as I left to take Leslie home. On the way, she was a little quieter than before. I guess she was feeling a little uncomfortable. When we pulled away, she kissed me gently on the cheek. "I'll see you with Billy," she said, and that was the end of it. Later, when I got home, I pounced on Dallas. "Didn't anyone ever teach you good manners?" I asked. "What's the problem?" he asked with the same smirk on his face. "You know," I continued, "I'm trying to decide if I need roommates," I said. Rich and I had discussed the issue of home ownership many times. We had both lived through the nightmare of eviction and the subsequent housing problems we experienced growing up. I had already explained to him the value of rising property values and the tax advantages of owning real estate. The problem in Seattle was that housing prices were so high that Rich's income as a truck driver made it impossible to pay a large mortgage. I asked him if he could live with Dallas and if he had any friends who could help with rent. He nodded and said he did. The next day, I drove by several houses for sale on Zillow. While they were all expensive, I figured there was still room for a significant increase in value. Later that day, I met with my financial planner, Danny, and asked how much liquidity I could get quickly. He told me that about half of the money he was managing for me was liquid, a little over $2 million. A few days later, I met with real estate attorney Landon Kirsch and formed a small real estate investment company. My idea was to find 3 or 4 houses worth about $500,000, buy them for cash and either rent them out or do something else with them. I already had a plan ready to go. That weekend we were at the Reef again. Once again it was Rich, Dallas, a few other guys and me. I saw Leslie at the other end of the room. Since we had hooked up that first night, I had been with her a few more times. But there were a couple problems. The first was that she lacked self-esteem. The second was that I noticed that I wasn't the only guy she was leaving the bar with. I know, double standard, but I couldn't help what I thought. And there were other girls at the Reef that looked like Leslie, and some seemed available, but I wondered if I wouldn't just get another version of Leslie if I pursued one of them. I wondered if I was getting bored with the whole Reef scene. And then there were the football fans. It started with the question, "Aren't you Billy Damon?" And then it went from there. A lot of them were nice, especially the Washington fans, who often bought me drinks. Even some of the Washington fans were okay, although occasionally there would be some jerk who would say how lucky we were to win the Apple Cup all those years ago. I just nodded and hoped they would go away soon. But there was one group of fans who were the worst. They told you about all the things you could have done better in the game. The ones who criticized your play when it was obvious they had probably never played organized football. Those types, figuratively speaking. B, standing on the sidelines and telling you what you did wrong, really annoyed me. I suppose the same kind of uninvolved criticism happens to actors, artists, musicians, and writers. I just got tired of those comments, as I'm sure others did. Later that evening on the way home, I wondered if it was just me, or if the rest of us were sick of the Reef, too. "I like the Reef," my brother Richie said. "It has cheap beer and usually a lot of cute girls," he added. I nodded. "My cousin talks about castaways in North Seattle all the time," Dallas cut in. "Maybe we'll try to go there next weekend." "Never heard of it," I said, "but let's give it a try." That week, I made a small offer on a house in a Renton neighborhood of blue-collar families. It was a cash offer, as is, with an inspection condition. Late Friday, they offered a slightly higher price and gave me until Monday to make a decision. It was still a good deal, but I had a few issues to work out first. I had a bit of a plan. That weekend, we decided to drive to Castaways. All the way there, Dallas was telling us what a great place it was, according to his cousin Vince. When we pulled up, I wasn't impressed. A low, dingy building with no windows and an old ship's wheel attached to the paneling. A neon sign flashed red lights, "Castaways." It looked like a dive. We went inside, and my first impressions were confirmed. It was a dive. Compared to this place, the Reef was a haute cuisine restaurant. I was about ready to turn around and leave when suddenly there was a shout from the far end of the bar. "Dallas!" Someone called out, "You did it!" Dallas, Rich and I were called to the far end of the bar near the pool tables. I assumed it was Cousin Vince who called out to us. As we walked, we picked our way through an unfriendly, rough-looking crowd. We've got to get out of here, I thought. Dallas introduced us to Vince and a couple of his buddies. They looked more like ex-cons, but they seemed a little friendly. I turned to Richie. "Let's get out of here," I said. "Reef doesn't seem so bad compared to this place." Rich only nodded, but he didn't seem to be embarrassed by the setting. I decided to get one beer, and that was it. I watched Richie walk across the bar towards the pool tables. I ended up talking to Vince, who I found out was a little rough, but worked as a sheet metal contractor. I started thinking about my potential real estate business and the fact that I would likely need reliable contractors. I started asking him about cost and other construction issues. "You know who's really good?" he asked, and nodded toward Dallas. I knew Dallas did something in the HVAC field, but apparently we had never talked that much about his profession. I sat for a while, thinking about the house in Renton and the fact that maybe Dallas could help me with something. I was deep in thought when suddenly I heard a noise from the far end of the bar. I saw two big guys, shorter than me, but much heavier, shoving Richie. It was the beginning of a bar brawl. Shit, I thought. I hadn't been in a fight since football. I wasn't looking forward to this, but this was my brother, and I had to get involved. I hadn't gotten 2 steps across the room before Dallas suddenly flew past me. He knocked the big guy down with one punch, and he collapsed to the floor. The other guy grabbed a knife. That didn't slow Dallas down one bit, and he kicked the second guy in the balls. His mouth opened in a wordless "oh," and the knife slipped out of his hand and fell to the floor. He slumped against the wall and slid into a sitting position. At that moment, a group of roughnecks from the front of the bar must have noticed what was happening. I saw movement heading toward the pool tables. "Dallas," Vince addressed him, "you guys better get out of here." And he opened the side door leading to the parking lot. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed Richie, and the three of us ran out the door straight to our car. As we pulled out of the gravel parking lot, I saw the crowd, silhouetted from behind the open side door, spilling out into the night looking for us. Luckily, we left before any of them could chase us. What a night, I thought on the way home. That night, I learned a few things. One was that Dallas knew how to build houses. Another was that Dallas was a loyal friend of Richie's and would stand up for him. Both of these points were important, but in different ways. This information helped me make my decision. The next day, after all the stories and recollections of the night's adventures, I asked Richie and Dallas to sit down at the dining room table. I had something rather serious to discuss with them. I handed each of them a folder I had put together in the morning, long before they woke up. "Okay, guys, I have a proposition for you," I told them. Rich looked at me while Dallas leafed through the pages in the folder. "I'm going to ask you guys some questions to see if this will work," said I. They looked at me in confusion. "First, are you both interested in owning a house?" They nodded affirmatively. "Would you be able to live together, perhaps with another neighbor?" I then asked them if they could afford the payments of $1,200 a month and if they could make a down payment of $25,000 each. I listed a few more conditions. They answered yes to all the questions. "What's going on, Billy?" my brother asked. I told them I have a plan. I'm buying a house in Renton. The pictures are in a folder. I told them I could either rent it out or they could each buy 25% equity. They will have to find another partner in the house who wants in on the deal. I told them I would retain a quarter interest in the house. They would pay me $1,200 each month. We discussed this for the next hour or so and went over any questions they had. I told them that I was going to get my realtor's license, and if anyone wanted out of the deal, they would be required to use me as the agent to sell their share. The advantage to Rich and Dallas was that they would be buying something that had value rather than renting. They would receive tax benefits and experience an increase in wealth as the value of the property increased. Otherwise, they would not be able to buy anything in the Puget Sound market for a long time to come, if at all. After our conversation, they both agreed that they wanted in on the deal. The advantage to me was the monthly cash flow, their down payment that I would use to buy other properties, the same wealth growth through appreciation that they had since I retained 25% of the house. And finally, if someone wanted to sell their share, I would get a commission on that sale. And another benefit, I would no longer have those two as roommates. The next day, I accepted a counteroffer and bought a house in Renton. The transaction was to take place in 45 days. Immediately, I went looking for other properties and signed up for real estate classes. My best advertisement was Rich in Dallas. They told all their buddies that they were going to be real estate owners, and their buddies loved the idea too. I had a whole line of potential clients to sell part of the house to. I met with my attorney, Landon Kirsch, and made sure everything was prearranged. All the terms were in compliance with state real estate laws, and the contract was fully executed. Rich, Dallas, and another of their buddies signed the contracts, and before we knew it, we were moving into a house in Renton. In the meantime, I found another house in North Tacoma to buy. Once I bought it, I kept buying. By the end of the year, I had 4 properties, with 2 or 3 people each buying stakes in their respective homes. I passed my real estate exam and now represented my own buying interests, saving agent commissions. I had a business to run, and it was a business that required little effort. I had a steady income from payments on all 4 houses, over $10,000 a month. I had money from down payments to buy other properties, and I had income from my equity in each house. From a business standpoint, I was in great shape. But from a personal standpoint, I was a little bored. I had the occasional chat with Rich, Dallas, and others, but it was getting tiresome. Tuesday morning, I was browsing the internet for current real estate listings when I got a call from my attorney, Landon Kirsch. "Billy, are you free Saturday night?" he asked. I replied that I was. Landon explained that he had purchased a table at the Puget Sound Children's Foundation's annual charity auction. He asked me to sit with him, his wife Helen, and a few other people. "And Billy, it's a pretty formal event," he told me. I smiled silently, knowing that my usual attire even at a meeting with a lawyer was probably sweatpants, and if I was feeling particularly formal, I wore jeans. I told him I understood and would see him on Saturday night. That Saturday, I met Landon and Helen Kirsch in the ballroom of the Governor Hotel in downtown Seattle. I was in a suit and looked somewhat sloppy compared to the others. Many of the men in attendance were wearing black ties. It was a decidedly different setting than the Reef. I wandered around the ballroom, happy to be in such a new, refreshing environment. It was a lifestyle I could imagine. There were tables of silent auction items, and many visitors were perusing them, pondering where to spend their obviously rich stores of money. At one point, I struck up a conversation with a gentleman, a Husky fan who recognized me. He was pleasant, but I found myself listening to all the reasons why the Huskies should have won that Apple Cup game my senior year. I nodded and smiled, my interest in what he was saying long gone. In fact, I was desperately looking for any excuse other than disgusting rudeness to remove myself from the conversation. Fortunately, relief came. "Charles?" Called a voice, and my chatty buddy, as I now realized Charles, looked away from me in the direction of the voice. My athletic instincts were still there, and I quickly turned away from Charles. The only problem was that I collided forcefully with the man on my right. I was so desperate for a way out that I didn't notice the man standing on the opposite side. The first thing I noticed was that my forearm was in firm contact with the victim of the collision. The second thing I noticed was a tall, handsome woman. "I'm sorry," I began. "I didn't mean to." And that was the end of it. She was a classic beauty, green eyes, a half smile on her lips, dark hair swept back, showing off the thin bones of her face. She was tall, easily reaching 6 feet in heels. With a half smile and intelligent eyes, she silently appraised me, amused by my awkwardness. After a moment's silence, she finally answered. "After all this," she began, still smiling, "at least we should be properly introduced. Madeline Doucette," she said, and held out her thin hand to me. "Hi, I began. Bill Damon. I took her hand in mine. We both stood there looking at each other in silence, my hand still holding hers. Finally, I came to my senses and spoke. Can I get you something to eat? I asked as we unlocked our hands. No. She tilted her head and looked at me for a few seconds. I thought maybe she hadn't heard me, and just as I was about to repeat my question, she answered. Sparkling water, please. I nodded and started walking towards one of the many bars in the ballroom, and then she called out, And Billy, fresh lime. I was happy to get her a lime drink, but I couldn't help but notice how she responded as if she was used to people caring about her. By the time I caught up with her and handed her the drink, several tables had passed. She accepted the drink with a nod, but not exactly in gratitude. I walked around with her for a bit, chatting casually. I got the impression that she didn't mind my company, but didn't exactly welcome it either. I liked her looks, and for some reason I was amused by her arrogance. For the next 10 or 15 minutes, we wandered together, looking at the auction lots and occasionally bidding. At one point, she turned to me abruptly. It's nice to meet you, Billy, but I need to get back to my table. She held out her hand again in a gesture of farewell. Madeline, I replied, not quite ready to see her one last time. Would you like to dance after dinner? I asked. Again, I got a long look before she answered. Perhaps, was all she said. I continued to watch her as she made her way to a group of tables on the far side of the ballroom. I sat with Landon, Helen, and the others at our table. We had an unremarkable dinner, and then a lot of people spent a lot of money on things they probably didn't need. After the auction, the lights dimmed a bit and a band started playing. I decided to wait a bit before I went in search of Madeline. Finally, I walked up to where I saw her walking. Luckily, with my height, I could see more than most people, and I spotted Madeline dressed in black at a table full of mostly men sitting at it. When I approached her table, she was standing with her back to me, but as I approached, all the people sitting across from her looked up. They all looked rich, arrogant, and unfriendly. I noticed an older man and a woman who had to be Madeline's mother. The resemblance was striking. Madeline, I addressed her. She looked up at me, slightly surprised, and looked at me with something of a less than welcoming expression. Would you like to dance? I asked. Again, no immediate answer. She looked at me, squinting her eyes slightly, and nothing in her face looked friendly. I had already prepared myself for a negative answer when suddenly she stood up, still as silent as before, gave me a brief nod and walked towards the dance floor. As I followed her, I could hear the light muttering of the people at Madeline's table. I think I even heard my name mentioned. No. We started dancing and I asked her who the people at her table were. To my surprise, she answered right away. Family, co-workers, and friends, she replied. We continued dancing and I was fully prepared for her to leave, but when the next song started, she made no move to leave the dance floor. We got to talking, and I learned that she works as an attorney at one of the large and prestigious law firms in downtown Seattle. For a big guy, I guess I've always been a pretty good dancer, pretty light on my feet. I got the impression that Madeline was surprised by my dancing skills. The second song ended, and the beginning of the slow song began. She paused, as if making a decision, and then with the same easy smile I had seen earlier, took my right hand in hers and hugged me with her left. As we drew closer in this way, we were able to talk some more, and throughout the dance I could feel her relax, and we had a casual, just getting to know you conversation throughout the slow song. As she relaxed, her body moved closer to mine, and I felt the combination of her slender athletic body and feminine softness. I loved the way she felt. When the song ended, she said she needed to go back to her table. I escorted her back. Once again, the neutral, hostile stares of her tablemates met me as we approached the table. I knew this game. They were trying to intimidate me. Maybe this group didn't realize that I was standing behind the line of scrimmage with professional halfbacks who said they were going to hurt me, and they meant it. A bunch of guys in tuxedos didn't really bother me. Everyone, this is my new friend Billy, Madeline addressed the group at her table. A new friend? I thought to myself. Maybe the dance went better than I thought. There were no greetings at the table. A few people gave each other a quick nod, but that was the end of it. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you all, I said in my nicest voice. I even took the hand of the man to the left of Madeline's seat at the table and shook it, surprising him. Remaining silent at the table, I prepared to leave. My focus was now 100% on Madeline. It was a pleasure running into you tonight, I began. Pun intended. I said it with a smile. And I got the first genuine smile back from Madeline. She liked my little joke. And thanks for the dance. Hope to see you again soon, I said and turned to leave. Billy, she said as I turned away. It was nice to meet you too. She answered me, smiling sincerely again. She even hesitated, as if she was going to kiss me goodbye, but then thought there were too many spectators. I turned to Madeline's group and wished them a good evening. There was no response. Walking back to my table, I thought about a few things. One was that I liked what I saw from Madeline, although I realized that it was only the tip of the iceberg. The other thought was that her table mates were too hostile, and I wondered what the reason was. I understand the need to be wary of new people, but this was out of line. The following week, I continued to research real estate and do minor work related to the properties I was now interested in. In the scheme I had chosen, the people who bought each property mostly took care of all the maintenance. I was a passive partner. I assessed my financial business situation. I had a steady income from my real estate partners, I had growing equity in each property, I had the money to buy more properties, and I had a lot of people interested in having a stake in their own home. On top of that, I was working barely 20 hours a week on average. Not a bad situation. I thought about Madeline for a few days after we met. I didn't have her phone number, but I knew where she worked. On Tuesday, I called the general office number for her law firm. Bradshaw, Miles, Rosen, and Rice, I heard the receptionist's voice say. Madeline Doucette, please? I replied in my most businesslike voice. Please hold, they told me. A few minutes later, I heard the secretary reply. Miss Doucette is unavailable. May I ask what this refers to? I froze for a moment, not knowing how to answer. Then I gave her my name and phone number and asked Miss Doucette to call me back. Saying I still hadn't heard anything by Friday and called her back. Billy Damon for Madeline Doucette, I told the receptionist. Please hold. I was expecting the same thing, but this time I didn't leave any message. Oh well, I thought. I was surprised to hear Madeline's voice. Hi, Billy, she said in a neutral, positive tone. We got to talking. I asked if she had gotten my message earlier in the week, and she said she had, but had been very busy. We chatted some more, and eventually she said she had a Zoom call coming up. I asked if she wanted to meet up this weekend. She hesitated. Billy, sorry, I'm busy this weekend. She said. I fell silent, once again thinking, oh well, but then she interrupted my negative thoughts. I'm free Monday night, she said. Okay, I thought. We'll see what happens on Monday. Monday, we met at Cecilia, an upscale bar in downtown Seattle. I was dressed in nice jeans and an unbuttoned long-sleeve shirt. Almost all the other men in the bar were in suits and ties. I usually stood out a bit in restaurants and bars because of my size, but now in this company my attire was different too. Madeline was dressed professionally and noticed me as soon as she walked in. She walked straight to my table and gave me a surprised kiss on the cheek. My mood got even better. We ordered drinks and an ahi appetizer and then shared a Caesar salad. The conversation was positive and easy. In addition, my impression of her beauty, if that is possible, was enhanced after this encounter. After talking some more, I broached a topic and I wasn't sure how she would feel about it. Madeline, may I call you Maddie? I continued without waiting for her response. What's the deal with all those people at your table at the auction? I asked. She raised her head with a puzzled look. Who? What people? She asked. All of them, when you introduced me, acted like I was a barbarian from a rival village who had come to steal their women. I said this with a smile on my face to make sure she didn't think I was angry. Don't worry. It was my family and a few others. Sometimes they can be a little shy at first, she told me. I sat there looking at her in silence. Shy, I thought. They weren't shy. They were acting like rude assholes. I kept those thoughts to myself. What do these barbarians do to the women they steal? She asked, looking at me and covering my large hand with her smaller, thinner one. I thought I might be on the verge of physical intimacy. This thought was reinforced when she asked me to walk her to a house 2 blocks away. We chatted during the short walk, but I was on autopilot. I was contemplating everything that might soon happen at her apartment. This is it, she told me as we stopped in front of a modern high-rise. My ideas about intimacy changed dramatically. It was clear from her body language that I wasn't going to invite her upstairs. Nor was I planning a strategy for what to do next. I was so absorbed in my fantasy of the night's cocktail turning into a new partner. Thanks for the evening, Billy. I'll see you later, she said as she walked out into the lobby. Maddie, I called out to her. She must have been sorry to see me standing on the doorstep, looking completely confused as she walked away. She stopped, smiled, came back and kissed me sweetly on the cheek. Call me, she told me as she entered her building. I was still standing on the sidewalk, looking inside with a confused expression on my face. Through the glass, I thought I saw her laugh as she looked at me again. That evening, of course, took a different turn. The next day I called her and got the same greeting. It was still the same. Miss Doucette is unavailable, to which this refers, and you can leave a message. I did just that. Another real estate agent called me and told me about a house in Madison Park, a very upscale and expensive Seattle neighborhood. Billy, this house is going to go fast. They're asking $600,000 and, he paused, it's going to need work, a lot of work. But Billy, you've got to act fast. Someone is going to get a hell of a bargain. He told me. I was interested, very interested. In fact, I already had a plan for what to do with the place if I got it. I told him I'd meet him there at 9 a.m., and on the way I called my financial expert, Daniel Murphy. Danny, how much cash can I get? I said. Like today, I asked him. He told me to hold on. After a minute, he said I currently had $463,000 in liquid assets. How hard will it be to find another $150,000? I asked. Quickly, I added. Hold on, he told me. After a moment, he spoke again. I could sell a couple things and probably have that amount of cash by the end of the day. But as your financial advisor, it's my duty to ask what you need all that money for, he added. Set. I told him not to worry and to call back in an hour or so. I arrived first, and it was obvious from the outside that there was a lot of work to be done. The roof, siding, windows, gutters, all of it needed replacing. The yard was a jungle. But I looked around. It was definitely the worst house in a good neighborhood. A very good neighborhood. There were several million-dollar homes on this street, and all the houses except this one were well maintained. Just then, Realtor Antoine Keys pulled up in his shiny black BMW. Antoine was a senior on the WSU football team when I was a freshman. We met again after I had moved back to Seattle and was in the process of buying real estate. He extended me an elaborate handshake, which I never got around to reciprocating. He then proceeded to tell me about how this house was a great deal. He told me that it would be on the market tomorrow, but that we might be able to sell it before then. When we walked into the house, I had 3 first impressions, and for me, none of them were bad. The first was the stench. I always liked it when the house smelled bad. It was usually easy to fix, but for most people it was very unpleasant. The second thing was that it was trashed. Broken windows, dirty bathrooms, smeared paint on the walls. All of these things were easy to fix. And finally, the house was beautiful. I could see the potential. Beautiful woodwork, built-in cabinets, classic arched doorways, and a grand staircase leading upstairs. The house even had a back staircase. It was used in the servants' era, a separate way to the second floor for those who weren't supposed to use the main staircase. Antoine and I looked around the house and yard. It would require a long list of necessary repairs, but it wouldn't take much to make it livable. By my calculations, the lot itself was worth almost $500,000. Okay, buddy, I said to Antoine as we pulled to the curb. What do we need to do? Billy, are you interested? He asked, surprised at the poor condition of the house we had just inspected. The family has moved back east and wants to sell it quickly, but Billy, Antoine said, they're asking $600,000. If they put it up for sale tomorrow, there'd probably be a bidding war. We're tying him up today. I think we can make it all work out. I looked at the house and then at the neighborhood. I imagined living here, having kids, giving them that stable childhood that Richie and I didn't have. I knew that's what I wanted. In my future fantasies, I also saw a woman who would share this life I had invented. And in my dreams, that woman looked a lot like Maddie. Antoine printed out the offer sheet, and I called Danny. I explained that I was buying property in the Madison Park neighborhood. All doubts about his fiduciary responsibility as my advisor fell away when he heard where the property was located. It was a very nice part of Seattle. After another handshake, Antoine said he would contact me early in the day. When I got home, I was thrilled at the prospect of buying a house in Madison Park. I was so excited I almost forgot that I was expecting a call from Maddie. Almost. When the phone rang just after 2 o'clock, I was glad it was Antoine, but hoped it was Maddie. Good news. It looks like I bought a house. I was nervous and excited at the same time. It was a lot of money for a house that needed even more money to fix up. But I had a plan. I was going to sell my house in West Seattle. I had a list of people interested in sharing in my own house, and there were 3 people I knew that I could sell it like all the other houses I'd sold. And my house was more beautiful than all the others I had sold so far. Their down payments would fund the renovation of the house in Madison Park. And the total payments from the 3 of them would have totaled almost $4,000 a month. Another cash flow. In addition, I retained a 25% interest in the house. Between selling my house and buying a new one, it was busy, and for most of the week I forgot about not hearing from Maddie at all. By Friday morning, I had done the title search, signed the paperwork, and moved on to the transaction of selling the new house. I would get the keys this afternoon. Shortly before noon on Friday, I got a phone call. I didn't recognize the number and figured it was probably the title company. I was very surprised to hear Madeline on the line. "Hello, stranger," she said to me. There was so much I wanted to tell her. I wanted to tell her about my house, about my plans, but I took a deep breath and slowed down. "Maddie," I said, "I'm glad you called." "How are you doing?" I asked, and we proceeded to make punctual small talk. Finally, I asked what she was doing on the weekend. "I'm free Saturday night," she told me, and we agreed to have dinner on Saturday. I would pick her up at 7 p.m. Friday night, I spent some time at the house making a list of projects. Dallas met me there at 7:30. Dallas, I learned, was quite a handyman, and, despite his sometimes scruffy appearance, was quite precise in his home improvement skills. I asked him to give me a quote on a few repairs. The next day, I arranged for landscape contractor Oscar Morales to have his crew come in and do the yard. While they were doing that, I started doing the most important cleaning in the house. I bought fans and odor neutralizers, so being in the house for extended periods of time was quite tolerable. That night, I picked Maddie up from her apartment downtown. I took her to a small bistro on the outskirts of Madison Park. There were plenty of good stores in the neighborhood. It was also only 4 blocks from my new home. We had a pleasant dinner, chatting cozily about life. At this point, I didn't say anything about the new house. I did, however, study Madeline. She was classically beautiful. Dark hair, a slender, athletic body with lovely curves. But in addition to her good looks, she had intelligence, personality, and an arrogance that I was beginning to like. I liked confident women. After dinner, I asked her if she wanted to go for a walk. She looked at me a little confused, but agreed. We walked down the street in a direction that seemed random to me, but I had a definite goal in mind. We talked about the neighborhood and the styles of the different houses. We noted the houses we liked, the well-maintained yards, and other notable architectural features. Finally, we pulled up to my house. "What do you think of this place?" I asked her. "Pretty shabby," she replied, "but it had potential." "Let's go," said I, walking up the walkway to the front door. "Billy," she said, "there must be someone living there. Come back here." I ignored her and invited her to follow me. She reluctantly followed. When I reached the front door and unlocked it with my key, she looked at me questioningly. "What's going on, Billy?" she asked. She followed me in. We stood in the entryway and looked around. Most of the smell was gone. All the broken glass and graffiti had been cleaned up. The place could still be categorized as a dump, but compared to when I first saw it last Tuesday, the improvements were significant. "I bought it," I told her. "You bought a house in Madison Park?" she asked. "When did that happen?" I told her about Antoine's call and the offer, without giving too many economic details. I explained what I was doing with my house and talked about how it would be a long-term project. I watched her watch and observed the craftsmanship that had been preserved despite all the neglect. Beautiful hardwood moldings, a formal layout, leaded glass windows, and a beautiful staircase in the center. "Yes," she said, nodding her head. "It's a long-term project." On the way back to her apartment, we talked about the house some more, and I told her about my business. Although we had talked a lot about our lives during our previous interactions, truth be told, most of the conversation had been about her. Maddie seemed genuinely interested in my business and what I was doing. I told her how I had invested my football money in a few starter properties and then came up with the idea of selling partial equity in homes to people like my brother, who are having a hard time becoming homeowners on their own in this market. As I traveled and discussed my business, I didn't go into much detail about my finances. At least at this point, she didn't need to know about all of that. But during the trip to see her, I felt like I had passed some unannounced test. Perhaps there was some kind of reward for passing it? My imagination kicked in again, and I was even more optimistic when she invited me back to her place. She had a modern apartment with light-colored furniture. It was on the 8th floor, and the small patio had a beautiful view of downtown Seattle and Puget Sound. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, one of which served as an office. After a few minutes of looking around the apartment, the beautiful Maddie turned to me and put her arms around my neck. My hopes for a grand reward rose. Then she kissed me. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," she told me, as she gently and firmly turned me toward the front door. And here I thought things were going in a completely different direction. Reluctantly, I walked to the door. When we turned to say goodbye, she must have seen the confused look on my face. "Billy," she began, "this is only our second date. There are rules," she told me. The next week was busy with my usual business, as well as picking up contractors for a house in Madison Park. Dallas and his buddy were doing the kitchen, but because of their work schedules, they could only be there on evenings and weekends. I was pretty hands-on and handled a long list of projects while relying on hired labor for finishes. Out of the blue on Wednesday, I got a call. "Hey, Billy," it was Maddie. "I thought I'd heard from you by now," she said good-naturedly. I was going to call her. I just didn't have time. "How about dinner Saturday night at my place? You'll bring the wine." "Sure." I was glad she called. "See ya." A click, and she was gone. The phone conversation was short but pleasant. Throughout the week, I was slammed with fantasies about Maddie every now and then, but then I talked myself out of it. I knew that by changing my expectations, I would be less disappointed. I shouldn't have bothered. Soon we were both on the bed. I didn't end up staying the night at her place, but we agreed to have lunch the next day. Lunch went fine, no awkwardness after our intimacy the previous night. Very comfortable. I was moderately satisfied with the discussion of our relationship, but I had yet to discuss the details. That may come later, but we seemed to have fallen into an enjoyable and satisfying relationship. I guess from a certain point of view we could now be called boyfriend and girlfriend. Meanwhile, things were going well for me. I continued to buy residential real estate and sell interests in each property, leaving a small percentage for my company. I was at the point where I could afford to hire someone to handle the daily calls, but at that point, I decided not to. The truth was that I didn't have much to do. That week, I had lunch with my financial advisor, Danny Murphy. He brought a large printout with all sorts of charts and graphs bound together for me to look over. Some of it I understood, and some of it I didn't quite get. The gist of it is this, Danny began. After you retired from football, you had $4,274,000. Since then, you've bought and sold 11 residential properties, not counting the house in Madison Park. Your share of those properties is just under $3.5 million. Your pre-tax cash flow is currently about $21,000 a month. He paused. You still have almost $3 million that I manage and a house in Madison Park. Sounds good, said I, wondering if there was some downside here that I wasn't seeing. Good! He was almost shouting. Billy, you're on the cusp of riches and you're not even 30 years old. You've got investments, cash flow, a house in a great neighborhood, and aren't you dating anyone? Yeah, I said. It's only been a few weeks, but she's great. Who is she? He asked. Her name is Maddie Madeline. She's an attorney at a big law firm downtown. I met her at some charity auction, I told him. Madeline, he said, averting his gaze and putting his index finger to his lips. Madeline who? Doucette, I answered. He paused and stared at me. Wait a minute, he said. What's the name of the law firm? He asked. It's called Bradshaw, Miles, something and something, I think, said I. Now he was really looking at me. I know who she is, he began. She looks great. But have you met her father? He asked. I replied that I hadn't, that I had only seen him at the auction, and he hadn't been formally introduced. Danny told me that he's a big supporter of the University of Washington and that he works for a large investment firm and has for a long time. He's a little arrogant, I've heard, added Danny. Madness! Later, I wondered if that might have been the source of the hostility. Maybe he recognized me at the auction back in my football career? No, I thought, that's impossible. Really? He certainly seemed arrogant. I would probably meet her family sometime in the future, but I decided not to worry about it until that happened. Not 2 weeks later, Maddie asked me to come to her mom's birthday party at the Rialto on Sunday night. Sure, said I. Meeting the family was a positive step in building relationships. And don't mind my dad, she told me. He can be grumpy sometimes. She said this with a slight chuckle. That Sunday night at the Rialto when we arrived, I realized I might have been a little underdressed. I was in nice jeans and a polo. Most of the others were in slacks and sport jackets. No ties, but certainly more formal than me. In the group were her mom and dad, 2 other couples the same age as her parents, and her brother Ryan, and a blonde girl Madeline said she'd never met. They were all sitting in a secluded corner of the restaurant. When Maddie and I walked in, the conversation abruptly stopped and all eyes were on us. There was curiosity mixed with slight hostility in their expressions. Maddie introduced me to the guests, and everyone seemed polite until we reached her father. I held out my hand. Billy Damon, Bill, I said to Mr. Doucette. So, he replied, showing no particular warmth in his greeting. Bill or Billy. This guy was already annoying me. Well, technically, I guess my name is William, I said, smiling at his sour expression. But my friends call me Billy. I explained good-naturedly, trying to melt the ice. Nice to meet you, William, he said. Robert Doucette. He finally introduced himself and then turned to one of the others, effectively dismissing me. I met my brother Ryan, and he turned out to be a miniature version of his father, though he didn't boast the same arrogance as the old man. Where I grew up, we had a word for guys like Ryan. Some of the other people seemed much nicer, and Myra, Maddie's mom, turned out to be pretty nice in general. She asked me all sorts of questions about my life. I think it was a mixture of polite curiosity and tacit judgment about whether I was good enough for her daughter. Fortunately, we were seated at the opposite end of the table from Robert. The evening dragged on, and as we were about to leave, we said goodbye to her parents. I noticed that Robert had had a few cocktails and a fair amount of wine. He didn't look drunk, but he was definitely affected. Out of the blue, having nothing to do with the topic of conversation, he turned to me. "You know you're damn lucky," he said to me with slight rudeness. I turned to Robert, not understanding anything. "Excuse me?" I asked. "You know what I'm talking about." His voice went up half an octave. "The football game, the Apple Cup. We kicked your ass all over the field that day." Slowly, it dawned on me. He was talking about the game my senior year of high school. It still bothered him. How weird. "We deserved that win. We were going to go to the Rose Bowl, and then the damn Cougars got lucky," he continued, the bitterness still fresh in his voice. I turned to him. "Do you remember your former coach Rick Neuheisel?" I asked Robert. He nodded, hostility and intoxication in his voice. "What's wrong with him?" "He had this expression," I said, and paused. "It goes something like this: scoreboard, baby." The meaning is clear. Despite what happened in the game, the only thing that really mattered was the final score. With those words, I turned away and said goodbye. On the way home, Madeline asked me what I had said to her father. I simply told her that we had talked a little about football. She froze for a moment. "Huh?" she began. "He looked upset, not happy about something." "That's me," I replied, trying to hide a smile. Although the first meeting with her family didn't go easily, our relationship progressed. We were together several times a week and usually spent the entire weekend together. She was the perfect woman for me. If there was a problem, it was the difference in our career goals. She was driven, worked hard, and was eager to move up the career ladder. On the other hand, my work week rarely exceeded 20 to 30 hours. My free time was spent at the gym or rejuvenating my Madison Park home. "Why don't you focus more on your business?" she would sometimes ask. It was usually in the mornings when she was rushing to work in her career clothes, getting ready for an early meeting or something. I, on the other hand, would often be lying on the couch in sweatpants watching the morning version of SportsCenter when she left. Of course, I didn't exactly look businesslike. I never told her in any detail about the success of the business I was involved in. I was accumulating wealth and income. I used my NFL money to become successful. I didn't buy expensive clothes or cars. The only thing I spent money on was my house. I wanted it to be perfect. That week, I received an interesting phone call from a college friend named John Washington. John was a freshman on my senior year WSU team. We had become friends my senior year at WSU. "Billy, haven't talked to you in a while," he began, "but I've always liked you. Now I need your help." "I talked to Antoine," Keys suggested, "and he said you help people move into the houses they own." I told him that yes, I do that sort of thing. Then he said he and his wife had just gotten divorced and they had to sell their house. He needed somewhere to put his half of the money from the sale of the house, but he didn't have enough money to buy a house on his own. "The other thing is that I need a place to live very quickly," he added. I told him that I didn't have a place to live right now, but I should have one in a few months. "A few months," he said. "I need something now." I told him I would keep his number and make inquiries. He wasn't too enthusiastic. Later that day, another real estate agent called me and told me about a house in Kent. "It's a hell of a bargain for the right buyer," he told me. It was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in a prime location in a nice Kent neighborhood. When he told me they were only asking $325,000. I immediately knew there was something wrong with the house. This house, as he described it, should be worth at least the mid-400,000s. "Okay," I said. "What's the deal?" "The house is in decent condition," he said, and then paused. "But there are squatters living in it. He told me." Nah. He said that the people who owned the house had been away for a few months, and when they came back, there were other people living in their house. When they asked them to leave, the owners of the house started threatening them with physical violence. It turns out that under some obscure law, these squatters, criminals, have rights, and you can't just ask them to leave. There's a lawsuit. I called Landon, my attorney, to get some information about squatters' rights. Here's what Landon told me. Squatters have legal rights. Washington state law allows squatters to live in someone else's property if the actual owner does not take legal action to force an eviction. In addition, squatters can claim full legal possession of the property under adverse possession. Landon, I asked, how is that possible? He had no logical answer. So, how do I get rid of squatters? I asked. He replied that the landowner would have to start the eviction process. This can be very expensive. When squatters find out they are being evicted, it often results in damage and destruction to their property. Another point Landon told me about is that over the months of the eviction process, squatters can run up utility bills, and then the rightful owner ends up having to pay them. It could easily cost you $30,000 to $40,000 before repairs, he explained. And there's no guarantee that the legal channel will work so that you get the property right away. I began to realize why the price of the house was what it was. I wondered for a moment. What if we forcibly evict the squatters? I asked Landon. Billy, he turned to me with a serious expression on his face. That would be illegal, and I certainly can't recommend it. He took a deep breath and turned his chair away from me, addressing me not directly. Yeah, but it would be the least expensive way to solve the problem, he reluctantly told me without looking me in the eye. But you didn't hear that from me. I began to think. I began to develop a game plan. I knew John Washington was a big man looking for a home. I remembered he had played offensive guard in college and at one point weighed under 300 pounds. I also thought about Dallas and his toughness at the bar that night. I considered a few more options. Then I made a series of phone calls. I called the realtor offering the squatter's house, called John Washington, called Dallas, and then made 3 more calls. By the end of the day, I had made an offer on the squatter's house and had done a little snooping on the Kent house itself. It was a fairly decent 2-story house. There was a chain-link fence around the house, and the yard was completely overgrown. The house actually didn't look as bad as one might think. There was an old upholstered couch on the porch, covered in water. It looked like someone was sleeping on it. As far as I could tell, there were 4 people living in the house. 3 men and a heavily tattooed woman. I continued to look around the neighborhood and saw a working tavern a few blocks away called the Ramblers Inn. At the back of the paved parking lot, I noticed an unused building. I stopped, went inside, and struck up a conversation with Lucky, the owner of the establishment. We came to an agreement. All cash. Everything seemed to be working out just fine. I went on with my plans but never mentioned what I was doing with Madeline. Madeline and I continued to grow in our relationship. We saw each other almost every weekend, and at least once, but often several times during the week. We still hadn't talked about love or long-term commitment, but I believed it would happen. I had a couple of brief interactions with her family, and my relationship with her father was still pretty icy. Meanwhile, back to the squatters, I borrowed one of my neighbor's dogs, and she and I would drive around the neighborhood where the squatters lived. I developed a strategic habit of walking this dog near the squatter's house. On the 3rd time, I started engaging in neighborhood conversations with them. Usually, they hung out on the porch. It was all set for the following week. Earlier that week, I made some flyers. Hey, are you guys going to the Ramblers party? I asked that Thursday. I was met with a blank stare. I explained that the Ramblers was having a customer appreciation event on Saturday night. Free booze from 8 to 12 on Saturday night, said I, and handed them a flyer. From the empty beer and liquor bottles scattered around the porch, I figured they liked alcohol. I also assumed they liked freebies. After all, they were squatters. Saturday night, I was in the back annex of the Ramblers Inn. I was paying for their regular bartenders to be in the annex for a customer appreciation night. I hung garlands around the building to attract squatters. Around 8:30, I saw 4 of them arrive. I called on the phone. At first, they were wary, slowly approaching the makeshift bar. I noticed that one of them was clutching the flyer I'd given them, as if it were a ticket of admission. By then, a decent crowd had already gathered here, attracted by the free booze. Even compared to the Ramblers' usual clientele, the squatters looked a caste or 2 lower. I approached them good-naturedly. Can I buy you a drink? I grinned, because everything was free this evening. They stared at me with blank eyes, and I asked what they wanted. They immediately pounced on the hard liquor. They huddled in the corner of the bar, not mingling with each other. They were here for one reason: to get drunk, and for free. Meanwhile, the squatter's house was bustling with activity. Dallas was changing the locks on all the exterior doors, and Richie, Dallas's cousin Vince, and two other men were stuffing garbage bags with everything the squatters had. Standing guard in the front yard were John Washington, his cousin Junior, who was almost as big as John, and another buddy of solid size. Several baseball bats lay nearby. Things were winding down at the Ramblers Inn. Judging by my watch, the squatters had already enjoyed a night of customer appreciation for over 3 hours. The lights in the annex began to turn off, signaling the end of the fun. By my calculations, it was going to cost me about $3,000. Less than a tenth of what it would cost me to go through legal channels. And I hoped, with much quicker results. I made arrangements with Lucky and quickly went to watch the squatters return to what they considered their home. It was almost comical. They didn't immediately realize that John Washington Jr. and their friend Clarence Mims were standing right in front of the cracked stone walkway leading to the front door. All three guys were big men, John being the largest, at 6 feet tall and weighing, by my estimate, 275 pounds. The other two weren't as big, but close. "Who the hell are you guys?" one of the squatters asked in an inaudible voice from the alcohol. "Well, son," said John, squeezing into the guy's personal space, "I live here. This is my home. Why do you ask?" "Back off," he replied, perhaps not quite managing the level of confrontation he wanted. "This is our place." "If you're talking about all the old shit that used to be in the house," John said, scooting closer, "this is it." He nodded toward a stack of black trash bags on the sidewalk. For a moment, the squatters, still drunk, froze, not quite realizing how swiftly events in their lives had turned, and not knowing what to do. Among them was a tall, thin man, looking like an asshole, who still hadn't said anything. Suddenly, something like a long, sharp knife appeared in the skinny guy's hand, and he drunkenly but aggressively moved toward John. A blur flew from the east side of the yard toward the skinny guy with the knife. Before the jerk was within John's reach, Dallas hit him in the head with a right. The guy lost his balance and fell face down on the sidewalk. "Now, bastards!" Dallas hissed at the squatters. "Take your shit and get this asshole out of here. And I'll tell you what. If any of us," he glanced at John and the other two, "catch you anywhere near this place, what happened to your buddy will seem like a picnic," said Dallas to them. "Hey, kid," the short guy started. "We got rights." "Well, screw you," yelled John. "I paid good money for this house, and you're not going to come in here and try to live your sorry asses in my house." By this time, John had picked up a baseball bat and was staring at the drunken, frustrated former quartet members. The ragamuffin group helped their wounded comrade up, picked up their bags, and left. Junior and John guarded the house for a few days just in case. But we soon realized there was no need. We never saw them again. A week later, John and his cousin Junior moved into the house, having each bought a 1/3 share of the house at a discount. I kept a third, and they made monthly payments. It was a good deal for all of us. I also hoped it would send a message to all future squatting attempts in the area. Next chapter. The next year went well. I continued to invest in real estate and make money available to interested parties. I bought 2 houses to rent out this year, and as I set things up, both had a small positive cash flow. Things with Madeline were also going very well. We were together for as long as her schedule allowed. She was employed by Bradshaw, Miles, Rosen, and Rice, and was also involved in town Republican politics. She was currently volunteering for a Republican mayoral candidate. I suppose she was interested in politics, but it appears that the driving force that encouraged her to move in that direction was her father. Certainly, Madeline is a strikingly attractive woman, tall, slender, with feminine curves. In my opinion, she can safely be categorized as a beauty. I also knew that there were many healthy male egos in both the legal and political worlds. But for some reason, I never envied them. One of the things Maddie always talked about was trust and honesty. I trusted her. I was reminded of an event. I can't really remember exactly whether it was about the law firm or politics. For me, they all kind of blended together. Never mind, we were in a downtown hotel ballroom in business attire. For me, that meant nice jeans, a button-down shirt, and a black sports jacket. For me, it was dressy. There appeared to be one guy there, about 10 years older than Maddie, maybe early 40s. Black hair slicked back and sharp eyes. He seemed to always be by her side, guiding her this way and that, keeping his hand on her elbow and talking quietly, his mouth close to her ear. At events like this, I usually settle down near the bar. It wasn't that I wanted a drink. It was that the people who populated the neighborhood were more often than not reluctant to talk about laws or politics, which was my preference. Nevertheless, I noticed the same guy next to her several times throughout the evening. Maddie and I had a predetermined plan for this as well. On the way out, she'd say, "Come rescue me at..." and then she would let me know the time she wanted to leave. Today the time was 11 p.m. At 11:05, I set out to follow her. Eventually, I spotted her with Slick at the far end of the ballroom in a shady alcove. As I approached them, I noticed his arm trying to wrap around her waist. I also noticed that she was making no attempt to move closer to him. "Hey, Mad," I said to her, ignoring Slick. "It's time to go." And I raised my left wrist as if checking the time. Slick raised a surprised and infuriated look at me. "We're having an important conversation right now," he began irritably. "Madeline will be free soon." When he said that, I looked at his arm trying to wrap around Madeline. This guy was probably 5 feet 11 inches tall and about 170 pounds. One of the main activities in my rather loose schedule these days was working out. I was in good shape at 5'6" inches and 225 pounds with a small amount of body fat. "Lance," she began, "I really should get going. Why don't we get together next week?" And with those words, I carelessly but firmly grabbed the bicep of the arm that encircled Maddie, gave it a quick but probably painful squeeze, and we left. On the way home, she thanked me for helping her get rid of Lance. I was about to get out of this situation. He was starting to unravel. She said, "Thanks for speeding things up." She patted my thigh. "He works on the mayor's staff, and for some reason the mayor is dependent on Lance. He has an incredible ego," she added. For a few minutes we drove in silence. "You know he wants to get in your pants," I told her. She laughed for a second. "Oh, Billy," and she patted my thigh again. "I know that." "What's more," she continued, "there's only one man I let in my pants," she said. A few weeks later, there was a celebration at her parents' home in Medina. It turned out to be her younger brother, Ryan's, 28th birthday. I've been to my parents' house a few times, and it was very nice. Stately home, lush manicured grounds, and beautiful furnishings inside. Myra, Madeline's mom, was always friendly to me, and today, in her home, Robert, her dad, was less negative than usual. That was a good thing, I think. I noticed that at this party, Ryan was with a dark-haired, olive-skinned woman. Last time I saw him with a blonde woman. "Is that Ryan's girlfriend?" I asked Maddie quietly. She looked at him, and out of a habit I was starting to get used to, she paused and thought for a moment before answering. "For now, I guess," she replied. I stared at her silently, wanting more information. "I think Ryan is trying to work his way through the entire female population of Seattle. That kind of macho bullshit." She said, "I think my dad likes it." "In fact, he better watch out," Maddie added. "Apparently he doesn't care if they're married or not." I paused to consider Maddie's words. I knew Ryan was trying hard to be like his old man. He was handsome, rich, and arrogant, but I wondered how much substance lurked behind that facade. Maddie was right. He really did need to be careful. Later that evening, after dinner, Maddie, myself, her father Robert, Ryan, and a few others sat outside and enjoyed drinks. Robert was smoking a big, flavorful cigar. The conversation was about politics. At this point, I wasn't adding much to the conversation. William, Robert turned to me. What do you think of local Seattle politics? He said it with an acerbic smirk. Any opportunity to discredit me he was sure to take. I took a deep breath and answered. I don't care if they're Democrats or Republicans, I said, knowing Robert is a staunch Republican. I don't think any of them really want to help the people they represent. They're more concerned with their own power. There was silence after my statement. Then Robert started to chuckle. You haven't told him yet? He asked, turning to Madeline. Dad, nothing has been decided yet, she told him. What? I asked, confused. William, your friend, he nodded toward Maddie, is planning to run for city attorney in the next election. We need someone who will be tough on crime. I turned to Maddie. Really? I asked. Billy, come on, she said to me. We'll talk about this later. As we turned to leave, I couldn't help but notice Robert's satisfied, smug smile. Any opportunity to embarrass me was something he relished, especially if it could cause problems in my relationship with Maddie. I happened to notice the same look on her brother Ryan's face as well. Once again, the younger asshole was up to no good. Leaving her family's house that night, I was calm. I understand that she has private conversations with her father and that I may not know everything that is going on in her life. But a major life decision like running for office, I expected that based on our level of closeness, we would discuss. Perhaps I misjudged the depth of our relationship, I thought. Madeline knew I was concerned about the information her father had shared. Billy, she began, I haven't decided anything yet. The election is still almost 4 years away. I was going to tell you that I know this is a very sensitive subject. Dad has been urging me to make up my mind, and I have to admit that I'm interested. She said to me, Look, Maddie, I said, this is your life. If this is what you want to do, take action. I guess I thought our relationship was at a level where we could have talked about something as important as this before. She sat there, brooding as she often does, and said nothing. It's okay, I told her. We're just dating. It's none of my business what you decide to do with your life. I said it and meant it. Billy, she exclaimed, my life is your life. I love you. I hope we can spend the rest of our lives together. If you don't want me to do that, I won't. You are the most important thing in my life. You're the only person I can completely trust. And you know how important trust is to me. I sat stunned. It wasn't like Maddie to speak so personally. We occasionally uttered the word love. I was thrilled with the idea, but the thought of a permanent commitment at the same time made me a little nervous. We ended up talking all night. We talked about our careers, our life goals, and finally, our relationship. Without a doubt, Maddie was an independent woman. Self-confident, not the type to depend on others. Deep down, I liked that, but sometimes it's nice to know you're needed. Tonight, she told me in her own way that I was needed. This marked the beginning of a more serious, intimate phase of our relationship. We started making long-term plans. Interestingly, among the many topics we discussed that evening, we never broached the subject of her involvement in politics. One night, a few weeks later on a weekday, we were having dinner. The plates had long since been cleared away, and we were enjoying our after-dinner coffee. Maddie was in midstream telling me about a particular case she was working on. Suddenly, she looked at her watch. Damn, it's 10:30, she exclaimed. I have to get up early, but I don't want our night with you to end. I wish you could stay with me all the time, I said to Maddie. I know, but... She hesitated, looked me in the eyes, and after a moment she said, Why don't we get married and make it legal? She said to me. I looked at her with a half smile on my face, wondering if she was joking. She looked at me again, completely serious. I'm serious, Billy, you're my man, she told me. I silently absorbed the strange turn this conversation had suddenly taken. I knew I wanted her, and I had many thoughts of marrying her at some point in my life. But when I was suddenly faced with the thought of marriage, the burden of that decision made me hesitate. I knew I had to say something. Maddie, I really love you and I can't imagine life without you, but, I began. I always imagined the sequence would be that I would buy the ring first, get down on my knee, and make a more formal request to you. I told her. I was kind of stalling for time. I wasn't ready to make such an important life decision at this point in time. Okay, if that's the way you want it, I'll go along with it. She told me, but you better not wait too long. By then, we were outside her apartment. I stopped and she pressed up against me, kissed me deeply, and looked at me with a serious expression on her face. Billy, I love you, she told me, hurrying to her door. As I drove home, I had a lot of thoughts. Mostly about the fact that this beautiful, confident, and successful woman needed me. But I was also nervous. My parents' dysfunctional marriage was a model of what not to do. I wanted to make sure it would work out the first time. Over the next few days, I continued to think about the marriage and Madeline. I had already described what an outstanding woman she was. What was the reason for my indecision? I pondered the question and concluded that I wasn't sure if I wanted to give up the freedom of being single. But there was another side to this coin. If Maddie wanted to get married and I hesitated, wouldn't I risk losing her altogether? I couldn't imagine not being with her. So in essence, I had determined my choice. Marry her, or possibly lose her altogether. These thoughts kept me on my toes, and I decided that maybe I needed a different perspective. I thought about the people close to me that I could talk to. My mom was an outlier. Although she is a very sweet person, her life had been traumatic enough that what was left of her was a shell of a person who went to mass every day and watched game shows during the day. She could not have been a source of great wisdom. I thought of my friends and mentally went through their list. Antoine, no. Dallas, no. Danny, no. John Washington, no, etc. I couldn't think of any of them who could give me the insight I needed. I decided to talk to my brother Richie. Richie was the closest person to me. He and I had been through a lot growing up, and I knew he was devoted to me and cared about me. We met at the Reef that Thursday night. Hey, Rich, I said, and gave him a brotherly hug. How's things going? Billy, things are going great, he said, a little more excited than usual. I want to talk to you about something. He smiled. And then I saw Rich look over his shoulder at me, and a smile appeared on his face. Hey, babe, he said. Hey, babe, she said back, and then, hey, Billy. It was Leslie. I wondered if Richie had something going on with Leslie. I soon found out. Here's what I wanted to tell you, Billy, Rich said, as Leslie settled next to him in the booth. Leslie and I have been dating each other exclusively for about 6 months now, and she's going to move in with me. He told me, and they both smiled. For a moment, I was at a loss for words, digesting this information. Like I said before, Leslie is an attractive woman. I knew that side of her up close and personal. But beyond her, there didn't seem to be much to her. At least not to me. On the other hand, I didn't know what their relationship was like. Perhaps they were having deep conversations about the meaning of life, volunteering to clean up the planet, and taking online cooking classes together. Congratulations, I finally said, eliciting genuine happiness for them. You're both very nice people, and I'm happy for both of you. They both sat grinning, happy in their new relationship, looking across the booth at me and alternately glancing at each other. I'll get us each a cocktail to celebrate, Rich announced, and strode towards the bar, leaving just Leslie and me. Suddenly, Leslie started acting stiff. Leslie, what's up? I asked, but she wouldn't look at me, averting her gaze. Maybe she was embarrassed because we'd slept together, I thought. Billy, she began, not quite sure how to look me in the eye. I've changed. You knew me in my wilder younger years. I'm not like that now. I really care about your brother, she said. I'm happy for both of you? I told her. We chatted some more until Rich came back with the drinks. He started telling me about their plans. Later, Leslie excused herself to use the ladies' room. I'm glad you and Leslie are happy, Rich, I told him, and I meant it. and they did look happy together. "Thank you," he said. "I need to say one thing," he started. "I know you and Leslie have had a relationship a few times, and I want to admit it, but let's never talk about it again." "Rich," I said. "I'll never talk about it," I said, and quickly cast a glance over my shoulder toward the bathrooms. The coast was clear. "I'm happy for you. She's a great girl." I drove home that evening and pondered a few things. Deep down, I was happy for Richie and hoped things would work out for him and Leslie. Like I said, Leslie was a good person. I just hoped their life would be good. That got me thinking about Maddie. I couldn't help but compare her to Leslie. It was an unfair comparison. Maddie was smart, wealthy, came from a privileged family, and had ambition. As I approached my Madison Park neighborhood, I began to comprehend all the information I had received and draw conclusions. There were plenty of girls like Leslie, and again I wished her and Rich nothing but happiness. But I came to the conclusion that women like Maddie were rare. And now I had one who wanted me. I came to the conclusion that I needed to take action. I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. I decided I wanted to do it the right way. I was going to buy a ring, with the caveat that she could exchange it if she didn't like the style. And I was going to formally propose. I also decided that I was going to ask her father's permission. Robert and I had never had a relationship that could be called friendly. I didn't trust him, and I think he thought I wasn't good enough for his daughter. Besides, we beat his team in the Apple Cup and he blamed me. Deservedly so. I think that if I show him some respect and talk to him first before I propose, it might start a general thawing of our rather cold current relationship. I called him at work. "Robert Doucette," he announced into the receiver. "Robert, it's Billy Damon," I said. I'd never called him before. Several bars of silence passed before he answered. "Hello, William," he began. "What can I do for you?" I seemed to surprise him with my call, but his arrogance asserted itself rather quickly. "I was wondering if there is a day this week when you can have lunch," I asked. "Perhaps," he replied. "I'll have Andrea get in touch with you." "Thank you, Robert. My number is—" But I soon realized that he had already hung up. What a selfish asshole, I thought. The next day, I got a call from Andrea, Robert's assistant, confirming lunch on Friday at 12:30 at Persimmon. I promised myself that despite his elitist attitude, I wouldn't let him hurt me. He reminded me a little of the talkers when I played football. As soon as you made it clear that their words bothered you, they won. In Robert's case, his jabbering was a subtle and not so subtle way of letting me know he was better than me. I wasn't showing him weakness. I was at Persimmon's at 12:30 sharp. Robert arrived at 12:40 without any apology. We chatted for a few minutes on safe topics: the Mariners, the weather, current affairs. So far, so good. At this point, he was exhibiting good behavior. "Robert," I began, "I wanted to let you know that I plan to propose to Madeline." He just stared at me. He didn't speak. He was beginning his intimidation game. I continued to stare back. We sat like that for over a minute. It seemed like a long time to me, but I knew his game. Finally, he answered. "Do you think you will marry my daughter?" he asked. "Yes, sir," said I. "I love your daughter, and I want to spend the rest of my life with her." He continued to look at me with a threatening look. It had no effect on me. "And you think you can provide her with the lifestyle she's used to and support her in her career as she moves forward?" he asked, a smirk spreading across his face. "Of course I think so," I told him. "I'm restoring a beautiful house in Madison Park, and my business is doing well." "Your business," he said mockingly, shaking his head. I realized he was trying to pick on me, but it was just disrespectful. He didn't know anything about my business. In fact, even Maddie didn't know the financial details of my business. And now this guy is passing judgment. At that moment, a waiter came over with a check, breaking the tense atmosphere. I quickly grabbed it and put down my credit card. After another moment, even Robert's manners woke up, and he thanked me for lunch. We both realized that the whole exercise today had been a failure. I had failed to achieve DC Tente with my future father-in-law. He had failed by trying to intimidate me and exerting his will over mine. In the end, in what could be considered the slightest concession to the topic of the day, we had a brief conversation on the sidewalk in front of the restaurant. William, as you probably know, Madeline is going her own way. She's smart and knows what she wants. He said, if that turns out to be you. He paused and said, well, then I congratulate you. Thank you. That was all I said. Later that evening, we were together at my house, just chatting. Did you talk to my dad about anything today? She asked. Why? I asked. She told me that out of the blue he called her on her way home from work today. She said he was acting kind of weird, asking what her goals in life were and if she was happy. Then apparently asked about me if she thought I was right for her. He asked her other things as well. Apparently, Robert didn't talk about lunch or my intentions. At this point, I made a decision. I figured I had gotten about as much blessing from her old man as I had ever gotten. It was showtime. I'll be right back, said I to her, which confused her. She looked at me with an expression of deep bewilderment on her face. After a minute, I walked over to her with my hands behind my back. Then I dropped to one knee. Oh my God, Billy, she squeaked, suddenly realizing everything. Madeline Renee Doucette, I began. Will you marry me? I said this and handed her the jeweler's velvet box. She accepted my offer. Many women would have quickly opened the box to check the ring size. But not Maddie, she just looked at me. Billy, the answer is yes, she began, still holding the unopened ring box. I love you. I want you. I need you. And I trust you completely. Much later, she called her mother, and the process of organizing the wedding began. End of part 1. Part the 2nd of may be coming out in 10 hours. Write in the comments if you're waiting for it. Also, give a like under this video and subscribe to my channel. I hope you enjoyed this video.